Suicides in Nova Scotia reached a record high in 2021. New data shows 142 Nova Scotians died by suicide last year. This after the number of suicides dropped in 2020. Tonight we turn to Dr. Simon Sherry from Dalhousie University's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. Thanks for speaking with us tonight.
You're welcome.
Simon, let's start off with yet another mass shooting, again at a school in the U.S., this time in Uvalde, Texas. When you hear of something like this, what are your first thoughts?
It's horrific, and it's absolutely horrible that it involves children, and it tugs at your heartstrings. As a father of young kids, I have a lot of empathy for those involved. I think it's also a critically important time for parents to look to supporting their children, and that can take various forms. Amid these type of adversities, don't depart from your child's usual schedule. Make sure that you listen and reassure. Despite awful events like this, there's actually never been a safer time in human history, and we're certainly much safer than we would have been 100 or 200 years ago. I also think it's a great time to emphasize attachment and closeness to one another, and especially to our children, to let them know that we're available for comfort and for reassurance.
And how does an event like this impact a person's mindset? I mean, people from all across the country, around the world even, are feeling upset by this, of course.
It's incredibly difficult because it's such an extreme event. It gets lodged in your brain, and you can lose track of the wider picture. An event this extreme tends to displace all other thoughts. It tends to dominate what we think about because it is extreme and it is horrific. One thing that comes to mind is there's absolutely a gun problem, and that's part of what's occurring here. But if you look at the gun problem here in Canada, somewhere between 67% and 80% of our gun deaths are actually suicides. So while this is a huge problem in America, there are more people shooting each other than in a place like Canada. When we have a gun problem here in Canada, it's often people shooting themselves.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, we aren't immune to high-profile shootings, considering the rampage that left 22 people dead in Nova Scotia just over 2 years ago. How do you talk to young people about events like this?
The massacre in Portapique is an extremely difficult event. It's terrifying, and it's touching on our population, and it will for years. When something like this happens, it is if a bomb has gone off, and those in its immediate vicinity will be harmed probably for the rest of their life. But there are also many more of us who are impacted by events like this. In fact, a single homicide can affect more than 100 people in a serious way. Many people are resilient and resourceful and will recover from exposure to these adversities, but those closer to the blast radius should seek help to try and deal with the aftermath of these events, because these events can be very traumatizing. And unfortunately, we know that there's often a very long time lag, 10 or more years, between being exposed to a traumatic event, like something such as the direct involvement with Portapique, and eventually seeking help and benefiting from what a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or another helping professional can offer.
Now, as mentioned off the top, new data release shows the reported number of suicides in our region were up over the previous year in Nova Scotia. Why do you think that number grew?
I think the story begins in 2020 with the onset of the pandemic. In the first waves of the pandemic, there was a feeling that Nova Scotians and Canadians were coming together and pulling together against a common adversity, the need to contain COVID-19 in our pandemic. But as the novelty wore off and the supports and services that were being provided in the pandemic started to necessarily disappear, I think we've seen an uptick in death by suicide. In fact, here in Nova Scotia, our suicide rates have never been higher. As you mentioned, 142 people died by suicide in our province in 2021. To give you a contrast, in 2000, that rate was 75 people who died by suicide in our province. So if you do a comparison between 2000 and 2022, we're seeing an 89% increase in death by suicide in our province. In fact, the numbers would suggest that between 2000 and 2012, no province had a higher increase in death by suicide than Nova Scotia. So really what this speaks to is an ongoing crisis.
So what needs to change to help this problem? Are there solutions?
Absolutely. It's vitally important to appreciate that death by suicide is preventable. And it's definitely preventable in our province. What we need is a government-led initiative to prevent death by suicide. The province of Quebec provided a recent example. Last week, they dedicated $65 million in funds with specific timelines and targeted goals aimed at reducing death by suicide by 10% in the first few years of this initiative. Such an initiative is very possible in Nova Scotia, and a key part of that initiative would involve what you call means reduction. Science tells us that one of the most effective ways we can reduce death by suicide is by taking the means by which people die by suicide out of the hands of somebody who's suicidal. Examples would be putting barriers on bridges, dispensing medications in safe ways so people can't overdose, taking guns out of the hands of those who wish to die by suicide. Another key aim for prevention efforts in our province would be to support people after they make a suicide attempt. When you make a suicide attempt, people are enormously vulnerable, and we should be actively connecting these individuals to psychological interventions or pharmacological interventions that are known and shown to save lives.
All right, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sherry.
I appreciate the chance to speak on this issue.
Dr. Simon Sherry is with Dalhousie University's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. Time now for a break. Stay with us. Murphy's Logic is next.